Okay, welcome everyone to this month's Tribal Climate Adaptation webinar hosted by the North Central Climate Adaptation Science Center. My name is Stefan Tangent. I am the Tribal Resilience Liaison for the North Central region. I work directly for the Great Plains Tribal Water Alliance. The goal of this webinar is to provide information, resources, ideas, and tools for climate adaptation at federally recognized tribal nations across the Great Plains. We are always open to feedback and suggestions about potential speakers. At the end, we would love it if you filled out a brief survey to provide feedback for us.
You bet.
Today, we have Indigenous scholar Dr. Dan Wildcat as our main speaker. First, I'll go through some announcements and updates, and then give a brief overview of the North Central Climate Adaptation Science Center before introducing Dr. Wildcat. And we'll leave some time at the end to make sure folks can ask questions or comments.
You bet.
Please note this webinar is being recorded, as is all of the information in the chat box. So just be mindful of that. And all recordings can be found here on our YouTube page. That's the North Central Climate Adaptation Science YouTube page. You can also find them on the North Central Climate Adaptation Science Center website, located here. And I'm gonna copy and paste all of the links here in the chat box so that you all can access them. All right. So those are all in that chat box if you want to access those. They're there for your resource. Okay, announcements. I'm pleased to announce that on July 20th to the 24th, we'll be hosting a virtual climate adaptation 101 workshop. It will be led by the Institute for Tribal Environmental Professionals with support from the North Central Climate Adaptation Science Center and NOAA. The trainings target tribal resource managers and professionals from North and South Dakota, but it's open to all tribal participants that may work on climate change issues. The workshop is free to participants. The financial support comes from Bureau of Indian Affairs Tribal Resilience Program. On my screen, you'll see the sign-up page. There's also a link in the chat box there. So if you're interested, go ahead and register. Next, AmeriCorps Vista, in partnership with the American Indian Higher Education Consortium, or AHEC, is offering the opportunity to hire a full-time staff member. They'll provide the resources and logistics to add a staff member to your team at a fraction of the cost of a normal full-time employee. An opportunity to add climate change staff and add support in your program. If you're interested, you can reach out directly to John Phillips. And for those of you on the phone, that is jphilips@aihec.org. John Phillips at ahec.org. Next, the National Tribal and Indigenous Climate Conference, or NTIC, is postponed and will likely be held virtually. Stay tuned for more information on that. Additionally, the 2020 National Tribal Leadership Climate Change Summit is to be held October 12th to the 14th, and that will be virtually, while an in-person event in Seattle, Washington is postponed until spring 2021. That's hosted by the affiliated tribes of Northwest Indians. Lastly, if you're looking for events, resources, funding opportunities, a great resource is the University of Oregon Tribal Climate Change Project, hosted by Kathy Lynn. It's got a wealth of resources, especially for funding opportunities, which I recommend. If you would like to subscribe to our monthly newsletter, see the link in the chat box, or you can subscribe to our website in the Tribal Resources section. Okay, I'm just going to take a minute to give a highlight of the North Central Climate Adaptation Science Center, or NCCASC. The NCCASC is a partnership between the U.S. Geological Survey, and a consortium of research entities led by the University of Colorado at Boulder. The NC-CASC fosters innovative and applied research in support of resource management and decision-making at the tribal, federal, and state levels. Areas of expertise include, but are not limited to, fire ecology, paleoecology, climate science, climatology, and wildlife conservation. NC-CASC serves a 7-state region, including Montana, Wyoming, Colorado, North Dakota, South Dakota, Nebraska, and Kansas. It's one of 8 regional climate centers and 1 national center, created to help meet the changing needs of resource managers across the country. As the Tribal Resilience Liaison for the North Central region, I work to connect the 32 federally recognized tribes with science, resources, tools to address environmental and climate change related challenges. My position is supported by the BIA grant and operated by the Great Plains Tribal Water Alliance. For more information there, you can go to the website here. Or you can also go to the Great Plains Tribal Water Alliance website. All right. Now for our main speaker. I'm pleased to introduce Dr. Dan Wildcat. Dr. Wildcat is a professor at Haskell Indian Nations University in Lawrence, Kansas, and an accomplished scholar who writes on indigenous knowledge, technology, environment, and education. He's also director of the Haskell Environmental Research Studies Center, which he founded with colleagues from the Center for Hazardous Substance Research at Kansas State University. Dr. Wildcat is a Yuchi member of the Muskogee Nation of Oklahoma and founded the Indigenous Peoples Climate Change Working Group, a tribal college-centered network of individuals and organizations working on climate change issues. Dr. Wildcat has published several titles, including the 2009 book Red Alert, Saving the Planet with Indigenous Knowledge. Now, without further ado, here is Dr. Wildcat. I'm going to stop my share. You can go ahead and share your screen, Dr. Wildcat.
Okay, how's that? Can people see it?
We can see it. If you want to go to presentation mode, and you'll be all set.
This is from the beginning here. Agela-san, Zoyaha, Yuchiha, Kadane, Adane. Good morning, everyone. I want to tell you, it's really a great pleasure to be here visiting with you all today. And I've only got a few slides, so I'm not gonna bore you to death with PowerPoints. If I had some of my interns handy, I probably would have put together something really snazzy. But I'm one of these old timers who probably harbors the same prejudice my friend and mentor Vine Deloria did, and he always used to grumble every time someone presented a PowerPoint, and saying, the problem is, the people who use those usually never have any power and they almost never make a point. So that'll be my defense for not relying on a PowerPoint. But we know that's not always the case. I have a lot of good colleagues that do good jobs with PowerPoints. I'm just not that person. So I've been wanting to do this presentation for a long time. I'm really glad that everyone that we had such a strong response on that poll about traditional ecological knowledges, because this can be kind of like the intro to that, because that's really the framework from which I'm speaking to you. And by the way, I do want to acknowledge that I'm speaking to you from the south shore of the Kanza or the Kaw or Kansas River in Lawrence, Kansas, in the ancestral homelands of the Kaw or Kanza people. The state of Kansas is named after those relatives of ours, and they call themselves the people of the South Wind. And anyway, so it's an honor to be a part of this program this morning, and let's just jump right into it. So it's all about the land, air, and water. I've thought about this for a long time. Someone in this audience may have been at the second intertribal GIS meeting that was held White Mountain Apache Reservation, and it must have been, I'm really thinking it was 92, maybe 93. Heard a lot of scientists getting up and talking about everything they could do with this geospatial tools and the sophistication, the kind of data they could create and how it would be useful. And they were all right on target. All the things they said were right on target. There was a gentleman in the audience, and he sat quietly and watched the whole thing. And he clearly wasn't a scientist. You know, he had on these Levi's and a flannel shirt and an old beat up cowboy hat. And I thought, uh-oh, this guy's, he raised his hand after they got done. And this panel of scientists, and he raised his hand and he said, I've just got one question. Can any of you tell me about the natural law? The natural law. And of course, they all looked at him, and I was thinking, uh-oh, here's Coyote. This guy's going to throw a wrench in everything. And, you know, they kind of scratched their head, and they said, well, no, tell us exactly what you're talking about. And this elder said, well, he says, you know, it's really about this, that for all life, biological life on this planet, there's only one law, and that's that you respect the land, you respect the air, and you respect the water. And he says, if you don't, there are going to be consequences to you as a living being. And of course, he was talking to humans in this forum, the human animal. And I thought about that a lot, you know, that really what it comes down to, are we conducting our human lives, our social, our cultural activities, our economic activities in such a way that we are respecting the land, the air, and the water? Because I think climate change is such a great topic, because really it fits so properly into this discussion. Because if you think about where we're at with modern science today, science is really primarily focused on the kind of relationships, the cyclical relationships that go on between the biological life on the planet and the land, the air, and the water. So now we know that we've got major problems with sort of natural cycles that are occurring that are affected by that affect climate change, that we need to be very, very mindful of. So we come from, you know, very different places. And so the slides I've got are really, this is Smoky Hills, Northeast Kansas, Wind River Reservation. By the way, these are all wiki pictures. They're not copyrighted. I put down a citation if that were required. I probably will do that later. But these are kind of wiki pictures here that I pulled down real quick. And just to say, hey, this is the beauty of, I think, drawing on our own ancient traditions of knowing that is so relevant to climate change today. We all know that the beauty of indigenous cultures are that they were emergent out of these kinds of symbiotic landscapes that we had, that we were a part of, seascapes too, for our Pacific Islanders. And my friend and mentor, the late Vine Deloria Jr., and particularly in his later life, started talking a lot about maturity. And his thesis, if I could kind of frame it this way, was that we're coming to the point to where we're going to find out as a species how mature humankind is. And his point was that we seem to be growing with progress and civilization increasingly immature, that we're inattentive to the life that surrounds us, to the land, to the air, to the water. We constantly live in ways that we sort of insulate ourselves from the balance of the life that surrounds us. Our ancestors did not. And much of what they understood about how they ought to live was a function of where they lived, what the nature of the land was, the character of the water, the configuration of the water, and they were always attentive to the wind. Among the tribes of the southeastern United States, of which the Yuchi are a part of those, moved to Oklahoma on the so-called Trail of Tears. There are many trails of tears, not just a trail of tears. There were many trails of tears. I know this audience will be aware of that, of removal. But in the Southeast, one of the most often, I know among the Yuchi, I know among the Muskogee, one of the most powerful clans is the Wind Clan. And if you think about it, the wind's the messenger. It's telling you about, it carries messages about, not only through our voices in that way, but carries messages about what is going to happen with our weather. And so the wind was something that was really very important. And so the Wind Clan is a very important clan among the people of the southeastern United States. So what I want to do is dive in here more deeply about why I think we need more than ever natural resource managers, tribal leaders, planners, entrepreneurs. We need our nations to be drawing on our own intellectual knowledges and traditions, because we actually have a tremendous affinity, if you will, with where the most cutting edge science is going today. So as you all know, the major critique of the difficulty of addressing some of the problems humankind has created as of late, including climate change, is that, as my friend Roger Pawarti at NOAA says, the problem is this, is that the world has problems, but our universities and research labs have departments. We put knowledges in silos in those institutions. We tend to think in boxes about economics over here, ecology over here, art over here, agriculture over there. And I think the advantage to our own intellectual traditions is we did not put knowledge in silos. We did not think in boxes, but we really thought, because our knowledge was experiential, it didn't come out of a box, it came out of the world around us and these very long-standing relationships we have from a particular place on the planet, and the nature of those natural processes that were going on there, is that we could think about relationships. We could think about processes. We never put knowledge in boxes. We never thought in silos. And so now when people are raising this as one of the main challenges, I think Indigenous people need to really draw on those deep spatial knowledges they have about how to live well in a particular place on the planet. We don't all need to live the same way. And I think one of the problems with the modern world we're in is many people have adopted this notion that we're in a one-size-fits-all kind of world culture now, and that, you know, people want the one size fits all. They want the best practice. Well, the best practice will depend on where you live on the planet, and then the nature of those relationships between our human selves, and then the balance of that life that surrounds us. So I don't think that's a romantic view. I think, in fact, I like to refer that to um, indigenous realism. That really what we're talking about is the fact that um, the world literally was our classroom, and our ancestors understood a lot, and we can bring in some of the insights and the understanding they had to apply to the modern problems we have today. So we'll get to some examples of that in a minute, but I'd like to, as we go along, if people have questions, you can put them in the chat box or wherever. I get real uncomfortable just talking. I'm more comfortable if we have a dialogue going on. And in fact, I'm going to stop share and go to my screen now. Stefan, can we just put me on? Yeah, me talking. Okay.
Yep.
Okay. So I think what we've got, the challenge that we've got right now is that a lot of people in the world think that there's a best solution, a best way of doing things. And what I want to suggest to you is that the best way depends on where you are on the planet. The main problem we have today, I would argue, is that we've disconnected culture from the places that we called home. We no longer honor a close symbiotic relationship with the places that we call home. And it's very easy. The kind of economic system we have, you can import your spring water you're going to drink from clear the other part of the planet. Well, that comes at a high cost to the planet, to the air, to the air quality, by shipping that by air to your home. And so we've kind of adopted a general consumer culture of convenience, of comfort. And what I would suggest, no one's against convenience, no one's against comfort, but that if we look at the cost of that, and then how our entire eco communities are paying for that kind of behavior, that we can actually do something better, that we can actually live more fully, richer lives by taking very seriously this question about how can we do that, and rather than live in such a way in this age of the Anthropocene, degrade the other life that we share this planet with, and the character of the land, air, and the water. How can we instead move to create systems of life enhancement? And I think that is a great positive way of stating what I believe. I would use the term exercises of indigeneity, the application of this ancient knowledge to very contemporary problems can give us ways to demonstrate that we can live richer, more rewarding, fuller lives by asking ourselves, how can I live in such a way that the systems around me, okay, are more resilient, are continuing to thrive and to grow rather than being in decline and being degraded. And I think that's really, to me, that's a very positive statement of why we need indigenous thinkers today to be very much engaged with modern science. By the way, this is not indigenous science or TEK holders versus science. No, that is such a false dichotomy, and it's really miseducative. There are some things that, modern scientists with methodologies they use and everything, they can understand and learn, such as maybe chemical, very specific chemical processes, or search for a vaccination for COVID 19. Okay. Now, I'm going to say that, but I'm also going to use this as a placeholder. There are also ways in which, if we were maybe living slightly differently, the likelihood of COVID-19 threats, those kinds of viruses, we might be able to reduce by changing the nature of our relationship with the balance of the world around us. So I don't like being called romantic. I don't like being called against civilization. I like being an advocate for indigenous realism that says experiential knowledge is very rich, and most of the problems that we confront in the world today, climate change would be one of them, poverty would be another, racism would be another. These are kinds of problems we can't put in any experimental box to control and solve. So what you need are people who can draw on experience, and over time, you use past experience as your control. It teaches you something. You learn something. The longer you live in a place, and as your ancestors passed down knowledge, you begin to understand more. There's nothing romantic in that. That's an intergenerational, longitudinal study that would blow the mind of any NSF researcher, because we think of longitudinal studies of 10, maybe 20, 25 years. Let's talk about longitudinal case studies of how to live in a life-enhancing manner, that's hundreds of years, thousands of years old. So I like to be in favor of exercises of indigenuity today, and I think we need to be working with our climate scientists, our atmospheric scientists, our modelers. But what we bring to the table is a deep local knowledge that can help us do things well right where we live. And I think that is so crucial.
I think, yeah, that's a really good opportunity to ask this question, which is, it says, I really appreciate the term indigenous realism. When faced with climate events in the past, we have postulations about how ancestral Puebloans or tribes have adapted. Do you know of any examples of how we can take the traditional stories of their resilience and incorporate them into, quote, science-based planning?
Yeah. So what I would say is, and this becomes a kind of a challenge. When you say incorporate them into science-based planning, I would say that, yeah, they become part of that planning. They are incorporated in. And let's use a couple of examples. So one example that I think that is really fascinating today is, let's talk about the wind. And so I said, among my people and the people of the Southeast, the Wind Clan was a very powerful clan, and it you by having that as your totem, of course, that meant you had a special kind of relationship, right, with the wind. Well, I think one of the things that we should be thinking about today to incorporate is that we are seeing now how globally connected we are. Some of you probably saw. So my point would be is that we need to. I met with some. Okay, now this is strange. Atmospheric deposition scientists. They have a national organization. Now, do any of you guys all know climate? Atmospheric deposition science are the people who do the chemistry of the atmosphere. And I thought, what am I going to say to these atmospheric deposition scientists? And I said, well, what I think I'm going to do is I want to tell them how we would see their job through an indigenous lens. So I talked about the wind. I also, this was right at the height of Standing Rock, I talked about the water protectors. And I said, you are monitoring the air quality, you're measuring all these, minute particles, microscopic particles that are in the air for our safety. And I said, I think really in a modern sense, you need to rethink of yourselves, not just as atmospheric chemists, as atmospheric deposition scientists. I said, really, what all of you are, or what you should be, are the air protectors. I said, we've got these women who started this movement at Standing Rock over the Dakota Access Pipeline, and you notice they didn't say they were protesters. They came and they said, hey, we are protectors, and we're sending a message out. And I think again, see, this is another way of framing the work we're doing. We get so lost in the weeds, we forget really what it is we're trying to accomplish. So basically, I ended up my talk saying, you guys are like the modern wind clan. You atmospheric deposition scientists are the air protectors. And I got a standing ovation. And I had someone come up to me afterwards say, I've been to these meetings for 25 years. That was the best presentation I ever heard. Now, not about me. I was just sharing a part of who we are and how we look at the world. Note that shift. It's a valuative shift. It's a worldview shift. I'm just not out there doing technical things. In the big picture, I better understand that my job is important as a deposition scientific practitioner, an analytic chemist, that what I'm really doing is I've joined the air protector clan. I don't think that's naive. I think that is so much what we need to do now. Think of the discussion we're having about policing today. The problem with policing is a lot of people are saying, wow, there's something wrong when you're afraid of the police rather than being protected by the police. So you start thinking about how you change your understanding of where we're at in the world, our relationship to the balance of the world around us. And I think, again, so that would be an example I would give. I mean, the scientists that I work with, I'm always telling them, don't forget the big picture of why you're doing this. It's not just about our human comfort, our human convenience, our human profit. Okay, that material wealth bottom line. No, the real measure for living in a healthy way right now ought to be, are we living in such a way, are we making decisions about land use? Are we making decisions about air quality and the kind of farming we're going to, kind of farming methods we're going to do in such a way that we don't have to worry about a degradation of water quality, groundwater quality, or runoff into our rivers and creeks that is damaging to the life and to the health of the beings that depend on that water, including ourselves. So anyway, I'll stop there. Any other questions that have come up? That was a great question.
Yeah, Robbie wanted you to elaborate a little bit on the racial injustice topic there. He said he's intrigued by your comments about other big issues like racial injustice, and if you had some more Native examples.
Yeah, I've tried to simplify some of what I've heard people for years, and I do want to honor those people like Dr. Henrietta Mann, Cheyenne scholar, Bill Tallbull, Northern Cheyenne. He was the first person I asked to be on the advisory board for the Her Center when we first formed it. Albert Whitehat, the legendary Billy Frank, my good friend M. Kalani Sousa. I could go on and on. Nothing that I'm saying is original. I'm trying to summarize some pretty fundamental points that I think will be useful to us, and particularly to all of you on the ground. So I want to say one thing. I want all of you that are working as a tribal natural resource manager, whether it's ag, whether maybe you're doing water quality work, maybe you're doing integrated pest management, and maybe you're the person who's responsible for testing the air quality. You're on the ground. You're doing the work. What I want to do is to suggest to you, remember what we're trying to accomplish. And what we want to accomplish is we don't want to keep degrading the quality of life, reducing the biodiversity of the planet. And so the kind of worldview shift we want is to no longer look at the balance of the life and the features of the natural world that surround us as resources. I think if you go back, I know in the Yuchi language, my cousin, who's a lot more fluent in Yuchi than I am, has told me that, he says, and if you go back into our, it looks like in our old language forms that we denominated through cognates in our language, the plant people, the animal people, and that they were persons. And many of you come from traditions, tribal traditions, where that's the case, that you think of the water as a living entity. You think of the mountains as a living entity. That's not romanticism. I would say that fits a paradigm of knowing how to live well today, wherein you quit thinking anthropocentrically about the balance of life surrounding us as resources, and you start thinking of them as relatives. Now, I know I hate to borrow my brothers and sisters from the Northern Plains language, because I can never shed my Oklahoma Okie accent, but they have a phrase which I love. And so please forgive me, relatives, but it sounds to me like Matakiwe Oyase. Matakiwe Oyase. What does that say? Well, one of my Lakota students told me one time, this is what that says this is what it says, Dr. Wildcat. We are all related. And it's not just talking about humans. Yes, those are our closest relatives. We are all related, but it's talking about all of the life and these systems and cycles and processes that we are part of. That's indigenous realism. Now, so I talk about racism. I think we'd do much better if we started thinking about everyone that we meet on this planet, particularly humans, as a relative. They're pretty distant. We haven't met each other in a long time, okay? But think how that would change your interaction if you came upon a stranger and you understood, oh, I'm meeting a long lost relative. I've never had the opportunity. That point of view, that point of departure is very different from one that says, ooh, I don't know you and I'm fearful and I better be ready because something bad's going to happen. And so I think we've got a lot of deep, the term of the day is systemic, right? We've got a lot of deep systemic problems. The argument I'm making today is indigenous thinkers ought to be a part of framing solutions to many of those problems because we never thought in silos. We never thought in boxes. And here would be my three-part summary. Let's figure out how we move from living in a world full of resources to one of relatives. Why is that important? Because the second principle would be, and man, have we ever seen this in this pandemic time? I'm not going to wear a mask because that infringes my liberty. That's my right. You can't tell me to wear a mask. I have a right to breathe freely. And here's the problem. Yeah, it's all about you, isn't it? It's all about your right. Well, what if we change that around and we said, you know what? Your rights don't mean anything unless you counterbalance those with inalienable responsibilities. And again, this is what I don't, no one's an expert on all indigenous people. I'm certainly not. Anyone who says that, you ought to immediately turn off anything they say because you can't be an expert on all the indigenous people in the world. But all of the indigenous people that still have their tribal ways that I've met, it seems to me when you're in song, in ceremony, observing their customs and habits, there's very little discussion about rights, but there's a focus on the responsibilities that you have to be a mature human relative. And so let's move from a world full of resources to one full of relatives. Let's move from a world full of this preoccupation. Now, again, don't misunderstand me. I think indigenous people have a tremendous respect for rights and moral and individual integrity and autonomy. I think, though, they always understood that the way that is cultivated is in an environment where people understand that we also have inalienable responsibilities. So we move from resources to relatives, from rights to responsibilities, and then we no longer start worrying about sustainability, but we start thinking about something, I don't know the exact word. Again, I would say, no, what we're not talking about is sustainability. We're talking about something richer. We're talking about systems of life enhancement, or we're talking about resilience plus. We're not talking about just after something's been disturbed, bending it back to the way it was. No, we want to actually something better. So we'll have resilience plus systems that we create. I see Brett's name on the screen. Brett, do you have a comment?
think maybe he unmuted on accident.
Oh, okay.
Yeah, that's
Okay.
why.
Anyway, but so, that's my story and I'm sticking to it. I think we've got a lot to offer. And, uh, some minds are, as my brother Kalani Sousa says, some minds are always better than one mind. So I think getting scientists together with indigenous thinkers is absolutely crucial right now. I think maybe we're going to have discuss some protocol and how we do that respectfully, and understand the importance of you know respecting knowledge. And there are some things we're not going to talk about. I don't believe in sharing tribal secrets. People are going to have things that are very sacred to them they're going to hold into themselves. So I'm not promoting that. What I'm talking about are some fundamental lifeway principles that we can sort of distill from all of these, thousands of years of being able to live in a place and live fairly well. It didn't mean we didn't have problems, didn't mean that we didn't have difficulties. At times we're threatened, but I think that we've got indigenous people have wisdom to share, and we can apply that wisdom to very modern problems, and that's what I call exercising indigenuity. And that's what I'm really promoting here today.
Thank you so much for that answer, that response. It really was very thought-provoking, and I really appreciate it. Thank you.
You bet.
I have a practical application question for you. So we talk a lot about, creating an opportunity to think holistically.
Yes.
This seems like a big challenge in the current paradigm, where a lot of particularly tribal resource departments and administrations are siloed. And so I was wondering if you had some recommendations or suggestions for how to move outside of those silos.
Yeah, I think one of the first things that each of you, and again, I tip my hat. You're my heroes. Those of you who are doing the on the ground work, and I know people like Mark, here in Kansas, and others of you that are doing really the on the ground work with tribal nations on trying to be resilient, plus in the face of climate change. Here's what I would argue. I think we've got to, you're going to have to be advocates for saying, what are we teaching in our schools? What are our children learning? How is our tribal council realizing that the issues of land use and zoning are absolutely crucial considerations to air quality, water quality, habitat, maybe even not protection, but restoration. All of these kinds of things that ordinarily we deal with, how we're farming. So I met a Western Kansas farmer a couple of years ago at the law school, and he was has a big farm, a big farm, several sections of land of wheat, and he's doing no-till farming. And so again, think of that. Okay, you don't have to turn the soil off and keep losing soil into the air. And so there's a number of farmers, Doug Cluck was sharing this with me from the National Weather Service, that are now adopting this no-till method of farming. So, and think of some of our ancient farming methods of how we did integrated pest management by maybe doing an attractor plant of a particular insect, or um, um, problem insect to a particular crop close by. I mean, you attract them, then you can get those insects out of there. There are all kinds of things that we need to do. But I think first and foremost is, we've talked a lot about this, Stefan, is that the questions about zoning, housing, oh my gosh, think of everything we could do with housing. We can build houses now that are truly put more positive things back into the atmosphere than take from it. We need to really look at moving away from the HUD spec home building on reservations to maybe, drawing on ancient traditions. We're not going to be building any grass lodges in the Southern Plains, but some people are experimenting straw bale home construction. I know some Pawnee young people that are experimenting with modern earth lodge construction. I mean, these are not impractical. These are exercises of indigeneity. How do we take the environment around us and find solutions that are going to be beneficial to us, enhancing the nature of the ecosystems we're a part of? So I'd say I know it's uncomfortable, but we've got to really work with tribal leadership to see that all of these things are related. As we say, everything's related. We're all relatives. And if we start thinking that way, I think we can really address some of the issues. So housing would be a great one. Tribal ag is another one. The kinds of the way that we're going to farm, rangeland management, how, replacing cattle with bison herds. I know many of you, particularly in North Central region, are doing this already, but these are very practical solutions to very real problems that we're facing.
Yeah, that's great. Thanks. If anybody has any other questions, feel free to unmute yourself. You can type them into the chat box. Got a couple minutes left in case.
Can I say one thing?
Please.
So I'm Marta, and I'm at Eco Arts Connections in Boulder. And Dan, I'm sorry
I recognize.
We did, and I'm sorry I dropped out of sight. I had some family tragedies, and I'm back finally. So yeah. I'm so thrilled to have this. This is a very practical question that I'd love to talk to you further about this. And first of all, thank you for your talk. It's just brilliant and so important. And our organization is an arts organization that works we call it transdisciplinarily, transsectorally. We try to, our blah blah about ourselves is we try to move from discipline-centric thinking to challenge-centric thinking. And because we look at the different disciplines as metaphorically as different species, so that, everybody's got their own language, their own assumed knowledge, their own acronyms, their own fashions, their own idea of what's on time and there's just a whole, anthropological study you could do, right? Or a fashion show. One of the things that we're finding is because of, and I thought it was so brilliant, the whole idea about, we have the world has problems, but the universities have problems. No, sorry, departments. Sorry, right. Is that worldview shift? Right. And so we brought a bunch of folks together from a couple of different universities and different disciplines to try to figure out how can we bring, especially together, scientists, natural and social scientists, artists of all kinds, what we call sustainabilists, who are the people on the ground who are, putting in bridges and pavement, all that those kind of land management doer kind of folks, applied stuff, and indigenous knowledge. And one of the things that we could have done much stronger on indigenous knowledge, but anyway, and the question that I have is, we then afterward had some webinars or calls choosing 5 or 6 websites, highly respected organization, to figure out if we were outside of that discipline, could we figure out 2 things? Could we figure out what they were talking about?
Mhm.
besides just basic English? And could we figure out how to collaborate with somebody
Mhm.
in some kind of, solving a particular challenge thing? Because if you're thinking ecosystemically, we want to work with the lions get to be lions, the bears get to be bears. Everybody does what they do best, but we do it together because everybody's got skills and resources and limitations and blah, blah. So we all looked at these websites and, we couldn't figure out what they were
Right.
doing.
Right.
And so, anyway, I'll stop there. But one of the things that, and this is the practical part, is we are now working on trying to create a template on how to resort information, people, fields of studies to be challenge centric instead of discipline centric.
Right. Yeah.
And so we're asking different people to come up with questions that they would want to that they would want to know about artists, to collaborate with artists, and that not artists would want to know about non-artists, to make that. And so one of the things I would love to do is have those categories. We've been sort of looking at the community-based social marketing categories, which have to do with waste, water, transportation, food, energy, blah, blah. But even those are hard. So I guess what I'm trying to say, while that is to say, I would so love to just totally flip it so that it would look for Anglos, to flip it in terms of this stewardship and relational.
I think you've got the right idea. Let me just respond quickly. I think you've got the right idea, that identify the problem. Maybe it's housing, maybe it's transportation, maybe it's an ag issue of with climate change, weather uncertainty. When do we plant? What do we plant? Do we need to change methods? So here would be my notion: is if you can present a problem that's not inside a department, it's a real world problem, then you can bring all of those different people to say, we think you've got something to say about what we ought to think about in solving that. Then I think we've got the key there. And I am going to say this because I just finished a piece. I'll have to, we'll figure out a way to reconnect, but arguing that really art may be today the most viable way of sort of communicating some deep knowledges that we need, because it is outside the box.
Right, right. Great.
And so anyway, no, I think let's be problem oriented solving, and then if we identify the problem, we just bring all of those different disciplines together to say, now you've got something to tell us about that we're not thinking about. So an engineer might have some great insights on the kind of water system you ought to put in a household, or the kind of heating system you put in a household, and how much passive can you use. Those are things that necessarily an architect, won't necessarily be expert at, but an engineer would be very good at addressing. You might have a question about materials. Get a materials engineering scientist involved. What's the best alternative insulation material we could use in this structure? How could we do a creative roof design so that we capture and can store rainwater? Is that even a good thing to do? Are we living in a place where rainwater capture ought to be a part of a home construction? So all of these kinds of things point to why we just need to figure out these ways and spaces to bring people together to solve the problems. And climate change is such a great example of why you need a lot of different people at the table to help us solve it.
Great. Thank you.
Yeah. Thanks everybody for attending. I think we're running over a little bit. We do have a good question from Paul. So Dr. Wildcat, feel free if you want to answer that. It's a bigger question, or you can, Paul can reach out directly to you, whichever you prefer.
No, I've seen some of the chat, and Alicia Harris has made a really good point. And yeah, I think art is an example where you've got to be very careful about appropriating things, misappropriating, things that you have no right to. And so art is indeed very powerful. So this is part, again, of those discussions that we really need to have. And I would say, let me end on this, because I want to be, so there are some cautionary things we need to think about. When we have these discussions with sort of scientists outside our communities, we need to establish very clear protocols for how that is done and setting some ground rules so people don't end up being hurt, offended, and a relationship can't even build because there's been something bad that has already set that off and made that impossible. So I appreciate Alicia's comment.
Yeah. Thanks, everybody. And thank you, Dr. Wildcat, for the wonderful discussion and webinar. I will send out a recording for everybody to access, or you can go directly to our YouTube page. We'd love it if you gave us some feedback, suggestions, or recommendations, and we'll send out an email to you regarding that. So thank you, everyone, and have a wonderful rest of your week. And thank you, Dr. Wildcat.
Thank you.
Thank you. Thanks.